Thank you very much. Good evening to all our friends in China. It's a real privilege to be with you this evening. I will keep my presentation brief for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we want to make this interactive. We want to have questions from you, and I'll be happy to answer them once I have finished speaking to you. The BJUI is an international journal. It's not just a British journal. We are the official journal of the British Association of Urological Surgeons, but also the international journal of the Hong Kong Urological Association and other societies such as the Caribbean Urological Association and the Urological Society of India and the Urological Society of Australia and New Zealand. So for us, China is very important. Now, let me tell you this. This is an important piece of information. Publications of researchers from China in prestigious Science Citation Index is maintained by a body called Thomson Reuters has increased steadily, with Chinese papers accounting for nearly 9.5% of those published in 2011. Compare this to about 10 years ago when that figure was much lesser. At the BJUI, the Chinese papers form nearly 10% of all that we publish. Compare this to the fact that our acceptance rate today, as of May this year, is only around 10%. So in order to get into the BJUI, you have to submit the very best quality articles. So here are some tips on how to do that. Let me give you some examples. The first is an updated prostate cancer staging nomogram called the Partin's tables. You may have heard of Alan Partin. He is professor and chairman in Johns Hopkins University in Maryland in America. And the Partin's tables were described a number of years ago, and when they were updated based on 6,000 patients between 2006 and 2011, rather than send the paper to, say, a journal such as JAMA, Alan Partin sent it to us. Of course, he's one of our associate editors for oncology, but it just shows you the quality of papers that are coming into the BJUI. Look at this. This is the effect of 12 weeks of tadalafil on ejaculatory and orgasmic dysfunction. But this is not a single center study. This is a meta-analysis of 17 placebo-controlled studies. So this is the level of evidence of the highest quality. And then we have a comprehensive cost-utility analysis of primary treatments for clinically localized prostate cancer. And this was a highly because it showed that radiotherapy was about 2.5 times more expensive than radical prostatectomy, and it caused a lot of debate on the BJUI online platform. And then we have novel science such as an anti-biofilm mechanism for wireless endoscopy. And again, this is a preliminary sheep study. We have a translational science section, but again, we will only take the best translational science. So for example, if you produce a piece of basic science, and we receive a lot of this from China, it has to have a translational element. Purely being first in animals is not enough for a journal like the BJUI. And then we have a consensus paper from the European Association of Urology Robotic Surgery Section, or ERUS. Again, this is a number of people from different parts of Europe trying to talk about robotic radical prostatectomy, and it gives you a flavor of what we are publishing from the BJUI. So what are the two important messages that we are getting here? What is of relevance to our Chinese audience? First, we receive a number of meta-analyses from China. These have to be of the highest quality. For example, if you submit a meta-analysis, it's very good, but it needs to be on a topic where there are a number of randomized trials. Sometimes we receive papers where there are only 2 or 3 randomized trials. That really does not lend itself to a meta-analysis because the data is just too new and not yet substantiated enough. Second, we receive a number of very good quality basic science papers from China. Again, whenever you are trying to submit basic science to a clinical journal, think about the translational elements of it because it needs to be important for human beings. In the end, our readership is those of surgeons, and surgeons are interested in what happens to our patients. And if there's a piece of science that is going to change the way we practice, it needs to be made obvious to surgeons. So, why do you think it is so difficult to get published? It is difficult to get published because there has been an exponential rise in the number of submissions to journals over the last 20 years. And the BJUI and our other sister journals such as European Urology, the Journal of Urology, is no different. This is true for all the top surgical journals, including those in urology. Second, the BJUI is publishing far fewer articles every year. My previous editor-in-chief was John Fitzpatrick, and under his leadership, the BJUI was being published twice a month. So the acceptance rate was closer to 35 to 40%. Today, our acceptance rate is around 9 or 10%. So it is 1/4 of what it was before. Now you may ask, why is this the case? We have realized that surgeons have short attention spans. They do not really have that much time to read, and therefore we have reduced the BJUI to once a month rather than twice a month. We also want to publish only the best papers rather than a lot of papers which no one has the time to read. This is not about a time-wasting exercise. It has to be about articles that are useful in day-to-day practice. I'm so pleased to just see that Peggy Chu has joined us from Hong Kong. Good evening, Peggy. And then if you see what's happening today to not just the BJUI but other journals, it is 12% of all articles submitted that are accepted for publication. In fact, yesterday I saw the May figures and it is 8%. So our associate editors are really doing an extremely good job in sorting out only the very best papers for publication and for our readership. Now, whenever you try to get a paper published, try to think of my perspective. Why should you think of it from my perspective? Because you are, after all, writing the paper. It is your piece of work. The problem is, when I see the paper, I want to be sure that it is interesting to the readership. An editor, above everything, is here to serve his readers. So it has to be interesting, not just to you, but to the readers of the journal. The second thing is, make it easy. If the paper is too complex, particularly for a surgical journal, surgeons are people who cut. By and large, they diagnose things, they then operate on the patients. These people have short attention spans. If you describe in a very prolonged way a simple message, they are not going to get it. So please, please, please make it easy for your readership. Now, how do you address the first point, which is making it interesting? The first way to do it is to make it methodologically excellent. So whenever you structure a paper, you have introduction, you have methods, you have results, you have a discussion. This is called the IMRAD method of describing a paper. You also then, these days, would have limitations of what you are describing. So there are various phases through which the paper has to go. But the most important part of it are the methodology and the results. So the methodology has to be clear. You have to clearly state what your aims were, what the objectives were, and how you attempted to fulfill those aims and objectives. The second thing has to be to look at the right audience. For example, if you are publishing something which is very topical on artificial insemination, then you're probably better off submitting it to the Journal of Sexual Medicine rather than the BJUI or European Urology. So look at the scope of the journal, and this is usually there in the author's guidelines. If you went into bjui.org, You can see the guidelines to authors. If you look at the paper version, again, you can see the guidelines to authors. Look at the scope of the journal and make sure that you address it to the readership. The third is to have a clear headline. Every morning when you open the newspaper on your way to work, the first thing you read is the headline. So the title and the abstract are the headlines of your paper. And these are the things which are of the greatest importance to the editor, to the reviewers, and to the readers. So please make sure that you have a clear title that is in line with what you're trying to publish and does not deviate, and a very clear abstract, because most people only have time to read the title and the abstract. And this is a very good way of remembering that the title and abstract are important. Remember this. If you don't, you do it at your peril. Remember, you only get one chance to make a good first impression. You do not get a second chance. So if the title and the abstract are not good, whatever else you write in your paper is pointless, because by that time it has been rejected immediately. It did not attract the attention of myself or the associate editor. It is certainly not going to pass the review process. Remember, you do not get a second chance to make a good first impression. How else can you make it easy? Well, here are 4 points that you should remember. Stick to the word limit. If I say to you that an original article should be about 2,500 to 3,000 words, and you send me a 10,000 word article, it is just not going to be of any use to me. It will be immediately rejected. Why? Because your article is not going to be the only article along with 2 or 3 others that are going to appear in an issue of the BJUI or any other journal for that matter. What you do know is that we have page counts. So my managing editor Scott Miller and I have this morning been selecting the August issue of our journal. He knows exactly how many pages are allotted to us, and therefore the word limit is very important. If you go over the word limit, you go over the page count, and that leads to an immediate rejection. The second is using the correct style. Each journal will have its own unique style. Please follow this style, because again, it is not my job to correct the style of your paper. It is very simple. You can look up the journal and format it to the style of the journal. This is a common mistake made by authors. They submit it to one journal, it gets rejected, they then take it off and submit it to the next journal of their preference. That is not the way to do it. By the time you submit it to the next journal, it needs to be formatted to the correct style for that second journal or the third journal. Otherwise, it creates a very bad impression. It just looks like you're submitting someone else's rubbish to me, and that means it gets immediately rejected. The third is to use a copy editor. A copy editor is a person who can help you with English or with the grammar or with the spellings, with the pagination, with the paragraphs. This is vital. If you send a beautiful paper with so many grammatical errors that the reviewers can't make any sense of it, it doesn't matter what science it contains, it doesn't matter whether it is a randomized control trial, it doesn't matter that it is a meta-analysis, it doesn't matter that it's the best basic science which would have otherwise gotten into Nature, it just does not matter. Because the grammar is not good, no one can understand it, it gets rejected. So please use a copy editor, particularly if your mother tongue is not English. My mother tongue is not English. I hail originally from India. At every paper that I write, I make sure that the grammar is correct. I make sure that someone else reads it. I do not want to be making these fundamental errors. And finally, include all the key information. For example, if this is a randomized trial, or if it is a registry study where you have reported on 1,000 patients with PCNL from northern China, then you need to have the ethics approval that it was an ethically approved database, or you had a database, or you had a randomized trial that had upfront ethical approval. You clearly can't do a study and then get ethics. you need to apply for it upfront. If it is a randomized control trial these days, I would urge you to get a trial registration number, which is as soon as you get the ethics approval. This is now an international requirement. You need to follow the CONSORT methodology, CONSORT, CONSORT methodology, and again, this needs to be very clearly detailed in the paper. Likewise, if you are reporting on a meta-analysis, then you need to follow what is called the PRISMA guidelines. You can look these up, PRISMA, PRISMA guidelines. If you're reporting on basic research, you need to have followed the requirements for kindness to animals, and again, it is important that you include these statements. And finally, you should include a conflict of interest statement. It doesn't matter if you are writing a paper which is sponsored by industry, or say it's a new tablet in China for BPH that is undergoing a randomized control trial and is funded by the company that is running that trial. That doesn't matter as long as you clearly declare your conflict of interest. That is fine. Everyone would be expected to have some conflict of interest, particularly if they're working for the pharmaceutical industry or in collaboration with them or with the technology industry. That is not the problem. The problem is if you do not declare it upfront, because that would lead to a rejection of your paper. So, the next thing is how to structure the paper for impact. So, the way to do it is to make sure that it has the absolutely highest impact that you can achieve. As you know, level 1 evidence is randomized control trials, and there is an internationally agreed way of reporting this type. This is the CONSORT statement that I just mentioned to you, www.consortstatement.org. You can access this from China. Please take a look at it, and do include a trial registration number. This is not peculiar to different nations on earth. This is now a standard of care, and it needs to be absolutely clear. I would say right on the front page, just under the abstract, needs to be the trial registration number. The next is how to structure further for impact. So you have got a nice title, you have got a nice abstract. The next thing is the introduction. So how do you structure the introduction? The first thing to say is this should not be the section of the paper that goes on for many pages. This needs to be brief, it needs to be succinct, and it needs to be relating directly to why you feel the research is needed. For example, say you are reporting on a study on mechanism of action of botulinum toxin. The way I would structure the introduction is to say botulinum toxin has been found in the last 10 years to be highly effective as a second line measure in dealing with patients with overactive bladder. It has a license now in various parts of the world for OAB, but no one knows for certain how it works. Finding out its mechanism of action would be of importance in describing how it works, and secondly, perhaps finding other pathways which can make other therapeutic options such as toxins available for treatment of overactive bladder. So that would be a brief introduction. But at the end of the brief introduction, there should be a last sentence or perhaps a last paragraph which needs to outline the research question, because that then leads on to the next step, which is why did you do this piece of work? You are setting the scene, so to say, as to why you need to do this piece of work. The next part of it are the methods. And the methods follow the introduction. And this is how I would structure the methods. Firstly, be clear about who took part, how they were selected, how they were recruited, who refused to be recruited, and so on. And this is of considerable importance if you're running a trial or if you are reporting a multi-center study. Some of the papers that we get are retrospective reviews. They clearly are of lesser impact. We tend to favor prospective, randomized, or prospective, comparative, or prospective, multi-center studies. But that doesn't mean we do not ever take retrospective papers. Sometimes, for example, recently I got a paper on nearly 6,000 patients who had lithotripsy over a 20-year period, and although it was retrospective, it was a nice database, and we decided to send it out for review. So you have to be clear whether it is prospective or retrospective as to who took part, how they were recruited, and who, more importantly, refused to be part of that study, and if they refused, why they did so. The second point is we do have a similar clarity regarding the measures. So who took part and what were the measures you used during your study. So the methods is vital. It is always important, if you can, to include a flow diagram. Now, I say this to everyone who writes a paper, that a flow chart is there to augment what you have written. It's very important not to write and then put a flow chart just repeating yourself. The flow chart is meant to be an adjunct to a complex structure in the methodology, just to make it more visible to the reader, going on the principle that a diagram can speak more than 1,000 words. So I think a nice flow diagram is very helpful and something that I use on a regular basis. The important thing, and a mistake which many authors make, is they include a part of the discussion in the methods. This is just purely methods. It is not results, and it is certainly not about the discussion. After the methods come the results. So how do you structure the results? Because the reviewers tend to quickly jump to this section and make sure that this is robust. If the results are not robust, your paper is not going to pass the peer review process. So, structure the results. Do not write the entire results in one large paragraph from page to page, because it is very difficult for the reader or the reviewer to grab it. So subsections can be helpful, and you can clearly subsection them as 1, 2, or 1.1 or 1.2, whichever way you wish to do it. The second is to be brief, with more detail being shown in tables and figures. A common error is to write 2 pages of results and then attach 2 more pages of tables and figures. I don't think this is very helpful, because you're simply repeating yourself. If you say, for example, this is a parallel group study where the 2 groups are age matched or sex matched, or we are testing a particular drug in a group of people with BPH versus placebo, then that's fine. The results then could say these people were matched for these criteria, and that could be put in a table rather than say they were matched for age, sex, handedness, comorbidity, so on and so forth. You could put those details in a table. In one column you put what are the measures by which they were matched, and then you put the control group and then the study group. So that's how you go about it. You don't go describing all the materials, all the results in the tables again in your text. So this is a very common problem. You need to avoid this. And finally, keep the tables to as few columns as you can where possible, keeping informative labels. Often we receive tables with no labels, and that is very confusing to us, because if it is confusing to us, then sure, it is going to be confusing to the reader. So please keep the tables to a few columns. Occasionally, if you're writing a review article, then you would have many columns because you have many review articles and you're making a summative review, or say you're writing a guideline, you could go into large tables, but by and large in the results section, please keep the tables brief and as few columns as possible, and please keep the labels very informative. So, continuing with the results, I think it is useful to avoid repetitions in the tables and text, likewise in the figures and the text. You need to be clear about these statistical methods and include clear confidence intervals. Why am I mentioning statistics here? I think statistics is becoming a very important part of our existence. These days, if I am conducting a piece of basic science, and for example in my own lab we are looking at the immunology of prostate cancer, we would be, when we start a set of experiments, I make sure upfront that a statistician is involved, even in basic science. What I don't want to do is study 20 samples and then realize that in order to have statistical significance, I needed 65 or 70 samples. I need to know that figure upfront relating to that experiment. Likewise, if you are doing a randomized trial, for example, or a matched pair, I would request you to go to your statistician upfront before you spend hours and a lot of money in running the trial, because they will do a power calculation for you. They will tell you how this trial is going to be impactful, how many people you need in each arm, and that is how you should be running it. I think it's a mistake to run these studies which cost a lot of money and then at the end of it go to your friendly statistician asking for advice as to how to do a statistical analysis, because by that time it is too late, and good journals have woken up to this and are no longer accepting these kinds of papers. And the final point in the results is to avoid discussion. Results are purely the results. They are as they are. They are meant to be matter of fact, and you should be avoiding discussions of results at this point in time. Now, after the results comes the discussion. How do you discuss your paper? Now, people often make the mistake of saying, let us start by discussing what is in the literature. I think this is perhaps not the correct approach. The best tip that I can give you for writing a discussion is to first and foremost give the key message and then talk about how it builds on previous studies. Not previous studies first and then a message from what you did. Give the message first and then build on previous studies. Now, one of the difficulties which authors often do is they are tempted to over-interpret. So, this is very common in basic science papers where perhaps you found a new signaling pathway for erectile dysfunction in guinea pigs, and you start talking about how important this may be in man, when actually not even an association has been found in men and your experiments have not dealt with human tissue. I think this is a common error and is to be avoided. Remember, association is not causation. Do not be tempted to over-interpret your results in the discussion. The next thing is to avoid trying to leap from findings. And this means trying to avoid saying that, therefore, this is the intervention we need. That is not what your paper is about. If you are reporting, for example, a study on PCNL supine in obese patients, it doesn't mean that that is the only way to do a PCNL to take out stones from obese patients. It simply means that that is what you did. If you compared it to prone PCNL, then you should say in a previous paper, this is what we reported in 750 patients who were overweight and had prone PCNL. Look at our change in practice. We are now doing it supine. These are our better results, or even better still, upfront report a comparative study. But this does not mean that therefore that is the intervention you need. It does not mean that supine PCNL is the only way of operating on obese patients. Just as a matter of example, do not try to leap from the findings. Be factual, and be factual about what you have reported, because that is all you have reported. What is increasingly becoming important is study limitations, and this is about interpretation and not justification. For example, I was reading a paper recently where the authors were trying to do a image-guided fluorescent analysis of bladder cancer cells. Now, clearly, all they had done was try to describe how this is done. It had never been done before. They were trying to standardize the methodology. They were trying to standardize the reagents. They were trying to standardize what the cells look like. But in the discussion, they started mentioning about how this might be the way forward in relation to urine cytology, the PTA test, NMP22, or other markers from the urine that are available today. Now, that clearly was not the main objective of the paper. The limitations were very clear. It had not been validated in a large subset of human samples. The study had not been validated in normal controls, i.e. they didn't have 200 normal human beings who had given their urines, which had been tested in that manner. And finally, it was not a comparative study with other markers in the urine for bladder cancer. So I think what should have been done was a list of limitations, and some journals now insist on this. I certainly would like to see a list of limitations towards the end, because that shows that you are perceptive, you understand what you have achieved, and equally you understand what needs to be done next. And finally, I think it is a very good practice to have a section right at the end on key messages, which must reflect the findings and not be just your opinion. These should be the key findings from your own paper. And I think, for example, Scott is sitting here with me this evening. He's very active on social media. I know we have certain restrictions to social media in China, but you have your own forms of Twitter, you have your own forms of Facebook. Increasingly, these messages are escalated not just to the readership of the paper, but also to others as key messages through social media. So people have shorter attention spans. They want to know the key messages. So do be cognizant of the fact that you need to put out some key messages. And finally, how can we summarize all this for you? Here are the 4 key tips that I can give you. The first is, please, please, please check the journal's guidelines. Very simple. You do not need to go to your library to get the paper journal to check the guidelines. If you, for example, want to submit something to the BJUI tomorrow, all you have to do is go to www.bjui.org. The author's guidelines are all there. Please read them. Please don't send me a reject paper from another journal without formatting the guidelines that we have stipulated. And please, please, please stick to the rules. Likewise, say you submitted your best paper to the BJUI, and unfortunately it didn't get in. It doesn't mean that it's a bad paper. It simply didn't get in because you didn't stick to the rules of the BJUI. If you want to submit it to another journal, then please go to their website, please find their guidelines, and please stick to the rules. Otherwise, this becomes a fatal error if the editor thinks you have simply sent them a reject from another journal. Please do not do that. Please try to keep the editor happy. Second, do get help with grammar. As I said, the best person to do this is a copy editor, and this doesn't matter whether you're submitting a paper in Chinese or whether you're submitting a paper in English. I think you need to be sure that a copy editor looks through your paper. There is nothing more annoying than receiving a paper which has a great message which no one can understand. That needs to be absolutely corrected upfront, because it is a fundamental flaw if you don't. So please engage the services of a copy editor. The third is be brief. Do not go beyond the numbers for the guidance of that section. For example, if an original article is 3,500 words, it should not be 4,000. It certainly should not be 10,000 words. Be brief and keep the methods very, very clear, as I have said to you many times before. And finally, remember that an interesting message helps, but do not exaggerate the significance or implications of that message. You need to be factual. It is not about suddenly going off-piste and talking about different things that have nothing to do with your paper. It is certainly not about speculation. In today's world, the message needs to be interesting, but it needs to be factual and should not be an exaggeration of what it might have been. Remember the final message to my friends everywhere, particularly in China. You'll be pleased to know, are going to release very soon the best of China. This will be in time for your annual meeting. I have already got two famous urologists from China to write the editorial with me. These are Yinghao Sun and Peggy Chu, who are not unknown to you. They are big names in your part of the world. And these days, the BJUI, if you haven't seen it already, seems to be featuring unique covers, in that we do not just take an image of a prostatectomy and put it on the front cover. We do not take an image of a bladder cancer and put it on the front cover. Tet Yap, who is our design editor, works in the fashion industry, and in fact he came up with these fantastic idea of having covers which relate to the article of the month. The article of the month is the lead article from that month. It features very prominently on the website, and the country or the city of that article features on the front cover. So this is a highly prestigious innovation that we have introduced, and I'm sure that in 2014 one of the covers will be Chinese, because we are receiving so many good papers from China that this is inevitable. But while you submit your best paper to us, please remember the one thing, and the one thing is this: you do not get a second chance to make a great first impression. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.